You just found out you're pregnant. Maybe you took a test. Maybe you missed a period and opened an app that told you your cycle was off. Maybe you called your doctor and had blood drawn and got a result the next morning. The point is, you found out with some degree of certainty. You had information. And from that information, you could make a plan. For the entire medieval period, roughly 1,000 years, this moment did not exist. There was no test, no confirmation, no certainty. Just a missed period, a shifting body, and the opinions of people who had no reliable way to know what was actually happening inside you. For most of those 1,000 years, being pregnant and knowing you were pregnant were two completely different things. And the distance between those two facts, the gap between the body's reality and any ability to confirm it, shaped everything: the medicine, the law, the theology, and the very question of when life itself was supposed to begin. So what happened? What did medieval people actually do when someone got pregnant? The answer involves a physician's theory borrowed from ancient Greece, a church doctrine that contradicted itself for 700 years, a legal concept that would resurface in the 20th century, and the quiet, extraordinary knowledge of women who understood bodies far better than any manuscript gave them credit for. Let's start with what a medieval woman actually experienced. The first sign was what medieval physicians called a suppression of the menses, a missed period. Bartholomeus Anglicus, writing in his 13th century encyclopedia De Proprietatibus Rerum, listed this alongside a set of secondary observations: a heaviness in the lower body, unusual fatigue, sometimes nausea, changes in appetite or skin. These were the indicators. No physician could confirm pregnancy with certainty from them. What they could do was form an opinion. And for most of the medieval period, an opinion was all anyone had. The earliest diagnostic attempts were creative, often futile, and occasionally accurate by accident. One method, documented in the 12th century Salernitan medical tradition, involved pressing on the woman's eyes gently after she had been lying still. The reasoning, wrong by modern standards but internally coherent by humoral theory, was that pregnancy altered the body's fluid distribution in ways that would produce a specific sensation. A different technique, drawn from the same tradition, involved urine inspection. The physician would examine the color, clarity, and sediment of morning urine, comparing it against charts. If a fine white cloudiness appeared near the surface, pregnancy was indicated. This was actually not entirely useless. Certain hormonal changes in pregnancy do affect urine composition. They were measuring the right thing with the wrong tools and occasionally getting a real signal. But here is where the medieval situation becomes genuinely strange to a modern mind. Even if a woman knew from her own body that she was pregnant, the law did not recognize the pregnancy as legally meaningful until she felt the child move. This was called quickening. Quickening, from the Old English quick, meaning alive, was the moment, typically between 16 and 20 weeks, when a pregnant woman first felt fetal movement. Before that moment, under church law and under most secular legal systems in medieval Europe, the question of whether a human life existed in the womb was officially unresolved. Not because no one had thought about it, but because the church had thought about it extensively, argued about it for centuries, and arrived at a position that was more philosophically sophisticated than it is usually given credit for. The dominant theory was enseignement, the idea that the rational soul, which made a human being fully human in the theological sense, did not enter the body at the moment of conception, but at some point afterward. Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century had expressed uncertainty about the timing. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, drew on Aristotelian developmental theory to argue that the soul was progressively infused. A vegetative soul first, then an animal soul, then finally a rational soul. And that this process took somewhere between 40 days for a male fetus and 80 days for a female. These numbers sound arbitrary now. At the time, they were a serious philosophical position based on Aristotle's Generation of Animals, the most authoritative biological text available in Western Europe. The practical consequence of this doctrine was enormous. Before ensoulment, as before the moment the rational soul was considered present, the legal and moral weight of the pregnancy was categorically different. Canon law treated early termination while still a sin as a different category of sin than termination after ensoulment. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 tightened church discipline across many areas of life, but the nuanced theological position on fetal development remained in place. What changed was the mechanism for enforcement. The confessional, also institutionalized by the Fourth Lateran Council as mandatory annual confession for all Christians, became the space where women's reproductive lives were scrutinized by priests working from penitential handbooks that distinguished carefully between stages of pregnancy, methods of contraception, and degrees of culpability. Quickening was the line, and quickening was something only the woman herself could report. This is the part that most modern accounts of medieval pregnancy overlook entirely. In the absence of any external confirmation, the pregnant woman was the sole authoritative witness to the most legally and theologically significant event in her pregnancy. If she said she had felt movement, movement had occurred. No physician could contradict her. No court could produce a counter-witness. When English common law, as documented in the legal treatise Bracton in the 13th century, held that capital sentences could not be carried out on pregnant women, a practice called pleading the belly, the jury convened to examine the claim was composed not of physicians, but of 12 matrons, other women, who would question and observe the condemned and give their collective judgment. The woman's body was evidence. The interpretation of that evidence belonged to women. This was not a system designed to protect women. It was a system designed to protect potential souls and to manage legal complication. But it created, as a byproduct, a zone of epistemic authority that belonged entirely to women, and which was, in practice, very difficult to challenge. Pregnancy itself was managed almost entirely within female networks. The midwife, the obstetrix in Latin, the sage femme in French, was the central figure. Her knowledge was practical, transmitted orally across generations, and in many cases more reliable than anything in the learned medical tradition. The Trotula, a collection of texts on women's medicine compiled at Salerno in the 12th century, and one of the most widely copied medical manuscripts of the medieval period, recorded remedies and practices that draw on this practical tradition alongside learned theory. Its recommendations for managing pregnancy complications, easing labor, and treating postpartum conditions reflect an accumulated empirical knowledge built from observation rather than theory. Some of it is wrong, some of it works. The church was present but kept a careful distance from the body itself. Baptism was urgent. Infant mortality was high enough that emergency baptism by a midwife, without a priest, was officially sanctioned if the child appeared to be dying. The ritual for midwives in many dioceses included specific instructions on emergency baptism. A child who died unbaptized could not, in Orthodox theology, enter H-even. The anxiety around this shaped everything. The speed of birth attendance, the relationship between the midwife and the local parish, the calculation of how long labor could be allowed to continue. And then there is what happened when pregnancy was unwanted. The Trotula contains, alongside its pregnancy management advice, materials on contraception and on provoking menstruation. The language is careful, and these are framed as restoring a suppression of the menses, not as preventing or ending pregnancy. This framing was not accidental. It operated in the theological space before ensoulment, before quickening, before the law recognized a pregnancy as a pregnancy. Medieval women, midwives, and the compilers of medical texts understood the doctrine of ensoulment and wrote around it. The historian John Riddle, in his 1992 study, Contraception and Abortion from the Ancient World to the Renaissance, documented the persistence of practical knowledge about emmenagogues, herbs that brought on menstrual flow, across centuries of church prohibition. Pennyroyal, Artemisia, and Savin appear in medical texts, herbal compilations, and indirectly in penitential literature that tries to prohibit their use, which is itself evidence of their use. The church said no. The knowledge moved through women's networks anyway. The two existed in parallel for 1,000 years. Here is what this whole architecture adds up to. Medieval society had no pregnancy test, no scan, no external confirmation of any kind. In place of those things, it built a system that rested, at its foundation, on the testimony of women about their own bodies. Not because medieval society trusted women particularly, but because it had no alternative. The result was a strange inversion of the usual medieval power structure. On the single question of when life became legally and theologically present, The woman's word was the only word available. We replaced that gap with certainty. We can confirm a pregnancy at 4 weeks. We can image a fetus at 8 weeks. We have removed every ambiguity the medieval world navigated through doctrine, women's testimony, and quiet herbal knowledge passed between generations. And we are still, in the 21st century, arguing about exactly the same question the medieval church argued about for 700 years. At what point does the pregnancy become something the law must treat as a person? Medieval theologians called it ensoulment. Modern legislators call it viability. Different word. Same unresolved argument, same stakes. They didn't solve it either. They just had fewer tools with which to pretend they had.